Welcome to Things You Don't Know. Today, we're looking at violence in today's world, specifically in the USA. The topic is controversial, and contributory factors, and whether they even are contributory, are heavily influenced by politics, religion, economics, and a plethora of other factors. Everyone has an opinion, which is fine. But as has been said, opinions are sort of like belly buttons in that everyone has one. Statistics are one of the things I rely on. But as Mark Twain said, there are three kinds of lies: little lies, damned lies, and statistics. In examining this topic, the statistics can be very misleading and not representative of the facts. I will claim my opinions when I have an opinion that I can't verify by statistics or other verifiable data. And I will try my best to simplify and kind of go through the statistics to get to the absolute truth.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will do our best to present an unbiased view. If something is not verifiable, we will claim it as our opinion. It is very nice to have you with us today.
Indeed. Now let's turn to some basic facts. Unfortunately, the statistics are not entirely up to date, partially because the government and the many agencies that collect these statistics have changed the categories under which they collect information. And this has caused significant delays in reporting, because it's difficult to do statistics on something if you don't have the same categories across the board. So violent crime stayed relatively the same in terms of percentage of the population, by which I mean that although the number of violent crimes increased, the number of violent crimes did not increase more than the population increased from 1960 until 2016, a whopping amount of time. In 2016, there was a 30% increase in such things as murders, especially by firearms. One confounding thing is that some include suicide by gun in this statistic. So to unravel that a little bit and make it make sense was a little tricky. But after reviewing the data and allowing for the variance, it seems that the number of incidents of murder, excluding suicides by guns, has increased by around 20% during this period of time that we're talking about. What is clear is that 75% of the murders that happen in the United States are committed by firearms. This is a new high, or low, as it were, for the United States. And never since we have been keeping such statistics has it been that high. There was another surge in violent crimes in 2020, followed by a significant decrease in 2021. Not a huge one, but a significant. A significant compounding factor was COVID. The COVID pandemic. That meant a lot of different things. But what we're really concerned about here is that it meant that fewer people were out in public. The trend towards violence in the United States and recently across the globe, which we're really not going to get into in this podcast, spiked between 2016 and 2021. As I've said before, there was some leveling somewhat in 2020 and a small reduction in 2021 through today in some calculations. Between 2019 and 2020, violent crime increased by 5.2%. Murders increased by 29%. Murders up 29%. Robberies decreased by 9.6%. Aggravated assaults increased by 11.7%. reported rape. And the reason I call it reported rape is because rape is one of the most underreported crimes that we have for various reasons. That decreased by 12%. Property crimes decreased by 8%. Burglaries decreased by 7.7. Larceny decreased by 10.8. And motor vehicle theft increased by 11.4%. Now, when you look at these statistics and you look at this is during the pandemic years, okay? It's sort of tricky, but it makes sense if you look at it. The crimes decreased. Why? Well, there weren't as many people out roaming around, is what I believe. Can't verify it for sure, but it seems like that would make sense. Murders, on the other hand, despite there being less people out, increased by 29%. I think that's really super significant. Robbery decreased by almost 10%, because guess what? People are home. You're less likely to go rob a house or other things of that nature. There's somebody sitting there watching you. Aggravated assaults increased by almost 12%. It seems like we have gotten more violent. Murders, aggravated assaults, these increase. Things like burglary decreased, larceny of other sorts decreased. The most interesting statistic in this is motor vehicle theft, which the reason I say it's interesting is because motor vehicle theft is the most likely crime of this nature to be reported. And it makes sense. If somebody steals your car and you can't get to work or you can't get around, you can't get to the grocery store or whatever, it's a problem, and you're going to tell somebody about it because you want your car back. Okay, some other statistics here. Persons aged 12 to 24 comprised 22% of the population, 35% of murder victims. There were only 22% of the pop, 35% of the murders, and 49% of serious violent crime victims. In the age group of 25 to 49, which constitutes 47% of the population, they're 53% of the murder victims and 44% of serious violent crimes. Interesting, huh? Persons age 50 or older made up 30% of the population. They're 12% of the murder victims and 7% of serious violent crimes. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a minute. But persons aged 18 to 21 were the most likely to experience a serious violent crime. And blacks across the board, but in that age group, were the most vulnerable. 72 victimizations per 1,000 were black people, African Americans. 50 out of 1,000 were Hispanics. 46 out of 1,000 were white. More than 52% of all rape, sexual assault victims were females. That's not unusual. And younger than 25. Okay. There's a couple of other statistics that are really kind of shocking. Almost 1 in 10 murder victims aged 18 to 21 were black. That's a lot, considering that they don't make up that much of the population. Okay, so we know from looking at all these things that race, identity, like being a member of the LGBTQIA community, or, racial difference is obvious to people, right? Like Asians, African Americans, they are going to be targeted far more often in terms of violence. The LGBTQIA, that's speculative as to why they would be targeted, but I'm going to get to this in a second. But the number of children that have been shot and killed and things is just astounding. Children, I mean, like small ones. So, despite politicized claims that this rise was a result of criminal justice reform in liberal-leaning jurisdictions, murders rose equally in cities run by Republicans and cities run by Democrats. They both screwed up, let's put it that way. about equally too. So-called red states actually saw some of the highest murder rates of all. For example, the murder rate in areas won by Trump increased by 40%, 40%, well above the average for the population. Gotta wonder why, huh? This data, and Dr. Deneen's going to say something about this. Talk about a really interesting theory. This data makes it difficult to pin certain trends on local policy shifts and reveals what really is a central flaw in arguments that seek to politicize a problem as complex as crime. Instead, the evidence points to broad national causes driving the whole crime scenario. There's myths, big time myths concerning recent crime trends, which bear statistical scrutiny, such as the impact of bail reforms, the role of progressive prosecutors, the role of guns, socioeconomic instability, and mental illness. And we can't dive into each of these real deep, but I can touch on some of them. According to one recent study, for example, there's no clear or obvious pattern in violent crime trends in jurisdictions that have adopted pre-trial reforms. Surveying the best available evidence from 4 jurisdictions: Harris County, Texas, Cook County, Illinois, Philadelphia, and New Jersey, I found no indication that re-arrest rates rose after reforms went into effect, or at most, any increases were relatively minor, like not statistically significant, like 0.4 to maybe 3.2% of all the cases which were charged. And, this is not what we would expect to see if bail reform were somehow driving spikes in crime. The same pattern has unfolded in New York, which is really sort of interesting. They did a good job of collecting data. After passing major bail reform legislation in 2019, the legislature panicked and they revised it just months after it went into effect. Then again in 2022 and again in 2023. Each time they did this, they cited concerns about public safety. The first 2 revisions expanded the types of cases in which judges were legally permitted to set bail or order detention. The third addressed judicial discretion. But in March 2023, an analysis by the Data Collective for Justice, which was really the first study to use statistical techniques to compare similar cases from before and after reform, that study paints a far more complicated picture of bail reform's impact on crime trends. Notably, the study found that eliminating bail for select misdemeanor and nonviolent felony charges under New York's original bail reform law significantly reduced recidivism. Reduced in New York City. Some critics have asserted that policies adopted by progressive prosecutors and blue state mayors, such as declining to prosecute certain nonviolent offenses or declining to seek pretrial detention in some cases, contributes to rising crime. But there is no evidence to support these claims. In fact, researchers have shown that the election of progressive prosecutors has not caused crime to increase in their cities. In one paper, still somewhat in the works, a team of social scientists analyzed crime data from 35 cities where more progressive law enforcement officials entered office, finding no statistically significant change in serious crime rates relative to other jurisdictions. A subsequent analysis by another team of researchers also found no relationship between progressive prosecutors and rates of robbery, larceny, or homicide. In some cases, in so-called progressive policies may, in fact, enhance public safety. According to a recent study of Suffolk County, Massachusetts, people who are not prosecuted for misdemeanors are less likely to find themselves in a courtroom again within 2 years. That speaks well of a policy implemented by former Suffolk County District Attorney Rachel Rollins, under which her office declined to prosecute many, but not all, nonviolent misdemeanors, such as disorderly conduct and minor drug possession without intent to sell. Similarly, reducing the use of cash bail may cut down on some of the harmful consequences of pretrial detention, which range from higher interest rates, higher rates of arrest, job loss, stemming from time out of the community. Some critics have attempted to assert a different theory, that liberal, reformist, or progressive urban governances may itself be to blame for rising crime. But the 2020 rise in crime rates, in murder rates, did not vary significantly based on a city's voting patterns. I already mentioned this a little bit, but a review by Dr. Asher indicated that murders increased in 2020 by approximately 29% in cities with a Democratic mayor and 26% in cities led by a Republican. The difference is not statistically significant, meaning that if you did the study several different times, you are not likely to find that this trend is borne out. Another recent policy brief by Third Way, which is a center-left think tank, points to relatively high rates of violence in red states, underscoring the truly national nature of the 2020 crime increase and the lack of a clear relationship with specific policies. Gun violence contributed significantly to the increase in violence, a trend that has become clear in national and city data. Gun assaults also rise in major cities through 2021. And according to FBI data, approximately 77% of murders nationwide in 2020 were committed with a firearm. Okay, as I said, the highest share reported in FBI data going back to 1960. There are some reasons why it only goes back there, but it has to do with statistical gathering of information. Now, here's an interesting one. Legally purchased guns also turned up at crime scenes more quickly in 2020 and 2021. Now, how do we know this? Well, law enforcement professionals track the flow of guns using a metric called time to crime. Essentially, the time between a gun's lawful purchase and its recovery from a crime scene. According to a report by the ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the percentage of guns recovered with a time to crime of under 3 years rose dramatically in 20 and 21. 1/3 of gun recoveries in 2021 involved a weapon bought within the previous year. Okay, so you buy a gun, 12 months later, it's in a crime. Half involved one purchased in the last 3 years. Gun deaths among children, I said I was going to get to this, have also risen dramatically, surpassing motor vehicle crashes as the leading cause of death for people aged 1 to 18. The leading cause of death for people aged 1 to 18. This data offers a complementary, more holistic and disturbing count. Rising gun violence. Look, the COVID-19, I've mentioned that before, as a pandemic, it led to a severe recession. One that was categorically different from those of the past. How? Well, while many white-collar workers were able to shift to remote work, people in the service industry, gig economy, and other sectors faced extended unemployment, making the COVID-19 recession the most unequal in U.S. history. Yeah, far more unequal than the Great Depression, far more than any other recession that we've had. It was unequal. The rich didn't suffer. The wealthy just kept getting more wealthy, and the middle class shrunk. Those challenges were compounded for people with a criminal record or who face a difficult labor market, even in the best of times. Although people in communities faced challenges in meeting basic needs, especially during the first year of the pandemic, many endured trauma caused by sickness and death. Families faced disintegration as parents and caregivers succumbed to the disease. The response by policymakers, particularly in the first year, was not adequate. It wasn't immediately adequate, breeding legal cynicism. That is, a belief that the government is illegitimate or unable to provide for its citizens. Community leaders struggled to deliver food and protective equipment to people who could not afford them either. They were screwed. Now let's turn to the topic of mental health and violence. It's been thought, in fact, one of the things that they do if you go to buy a gun is they check your mental health history. All right, let's look at that and see. And I don't object to that. I think that's reasonable for a whole lot of other reasons. But people with mental illness are more likely to be the victim of violent crime than the perpetrator of violent crime. This bias extends all the way to the criminal justice system, where persons with mental illness get treated as criminals, arrested, charged, and jailed for actually a longer time in jail compared to the general population. I'm talking about the people that are arrested. Okay. The move to deinstitutionalize the mentally ill was a positive thing in many ways. However, in combination with several other factors, there have been disastrous side effects. Consider this: a situation in which a person with a long-term mental illness who has not developed some job skills, hasn't been socializing with the, quote, normal people in the population, lacks minimal life management skills, because guess what? If they've been in an institution, they'll have to. Somebody makes food, somebody serves it to them, somebody tells them when to get up, da-da-da-da-da. And they have no resources. They're discharged from the facility. They're probably going to act a little strange. They have a very increased chance of being homeless. And they're very likely to come into contact and be noticed and come into contact with law enforcement. Okay, and here's this cop on the corner. Okay, law enforcement personnel don't have the training. They don't have the resources to know what to do with these people. So they find some charge to arrest them on. They're put in jail or in prison. So we've shifted putting people with mental illness into hospitals where ostensibly they could get some help, to putting them in jails where they are simply managed. Okay? It must be said there are few circumstances wherein the mentally ill have a greater propensity for violence, although still at a rate less than the general population. Those with ASD, that means antisocial personality disorders, particularly of the psychopathic type of personality disorder, those people, they're likely to either be a politician, in which case they often get others to commit the crimes for them, and they just sit back and enjoy it, or they may have some proclivity towards violence. The other situation is when a person has a mental illness with what we call a comorbid, that means occurring at the same time, substance abuse problem. Even including these circumstances, a mentally ill person is less likely to resort to violence than the general population. And 1 in 4 people in the USA suffer from some kind of mental illness at any given time. Most of the time, it's hidden. People don't know. So, I mean, it's sort of a statistic that you have to take with a grain of salt, but I think that it's probably at least that severe, if not worse. It is also my opinion that the trend towards violent solutions to situations started at the top in the USA. I think the trend started with the notion that we should impose our ideas and culture all around the world. And this continues despite the fact that we don't have the highest standard of living in the world. We are one of the more violent countries in the world. But still, we want to export and impose our culture on others. You know, we could say it started with Korea, or more clearly, just but in terms of the U.S. with the war in Vietnam, and then invading Iraq under very specious pretenses. We assumed that they were weapons of mass destruction based on, I don't know, rumors, no proof, because certainly when we got there, we didn't find them. It made us look really bad, but we kept on trucking. Okay, and then continuing on. Yes, and this was exacerbated by 9/11. Not denying that at all. There were we were prodded with a big stick, so to speak. Then we continued on with the president who vilified a person with special needs during a campaign. I watched it on TV. It was not fake. Directed a room full of pictures to attack the person and kick him out. And then later on, directing a crowd to physically attack the seat of the government. March on them, because if you don't, you're not going to have anything, kind of crap. All right. I mean, it was there. It's clear. There's no equivocation. I'm not blaming all the upsurge in violence on Trump. Yeah, that's who I'm talking about. My opinion, once again. However, he is enough of a megalomaniac, in my opinion, to believe that he has that much power. But I am saying, instead of helping to move the country in a more peaceful direction, he followed and amped up a trend, even down to paraphrasing Hitler's campaign promise, "I will make Germany great again." Sound familiar? Oh, yeah, sure does to me. I realize my opinion will infuriate some. But last time I checked, we still had some freedom of speech here. Look, I don't vilify those with different opinions. But, quite frankly, I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of vilification in return for expressing my opinion, and I'm willing to take that, I guess.
The foundation of any free society is the right of any human being to express their opinions in a nonviolent manner. Overly restrictive societies tend to manufacture crimes because of a lack of national unity and a reluctance to trust. Perhaps the greatest American example is probably the prohibition of alcohol of the 1920s and some aspects of the drug war in our own time. Society tends to vacillate between varying periods of great harmony and unity and polarization and disorder, what we call long-term and short-term thinking, national pride, and egotism and panic. A society focused on long-term thinking tends to think in the long term, but a society focused on short-term thinking tends to ignore current problems, focus on pleasure, and the pursuit of a universal goal. Non-democratic societies in general seem to go this way. The two biggest and most egregious dictatorships in history underutilized valuable resources in the name of their ideology. Communism overfocused on the ideal of world revolution, thus destroying its economy and using force rather than persuasion. Nazism worshipped the evil Aryan race idea, thus depriving Germany of overly religious, Jewish, Slavic scientists and businessmen, and depriving their nation of the benefits these people they scorned as Untermenschen could have brought to the Reich. Western capitalist societies tend to be very short-term focused, which causes addict-style thinking, prioritizing pleasure at the expense of development and long-term benefit. Chest thumping by political leaders on all spectrums make many enemies. This is demonstrated in the media, business, and politics today. Noted sociologist and political scientist Dr. Neil Howe has two brilliant books, The Fourth Turning and The Fourth Turning is Here, which cover this idea. Howe's work structures history around what is called a secularum, a repeated pattern of a four-phase societal cycle that he believes takes place every 60 to 80 years. At the beginning, a benevolent, largely decent, although imperfect society begins on a great positive societal ideal. Dr. Howe calls this a high. According to this theory, historical events are associated with recurring generational personas, what he calls archetypes, heroes, nomads, prophets, and lost. Each general persona unleashes a new era, which is called a turning, lasting around 20 to 25 years, at the end of which a new social, political, and economic climate based on a national mood exists. These are part of a larger cyclical secularum defined as a long human life of 80 to 100 years. This theory states that a crisis recurs at the end of every secularum, which is followed by a high or a recovery. During a recovery, communitarian values, political principles, and institutions are very strong. Ultimately, succeeding generational archetypes attack and weaken institutions in the name of autonomy and individualism, which eventually creates a tumultuous political environment that ripens conditions for another crisis. Awareness of societal challenges leads to the next step from a high, which is called an awakening. And different attitudes lead to different levels of conformity. As Dr. Howe said, in a high, people want to belong. In an awakening, they want to rebel. The last high began in the United States after VJ Day in 1945. The victory over Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, as well as the dissolving of the British, French, Dutch, and Belgian empires over the next 10 years, gave the United States control over the Western world. Capitalism was used to rebuild the West, thus providing new markets, greater product development, and cultural hegemony. The Judeo-Christian version of spirituality provided a social and cultural framework for the development of ideas. This was the time known as the can-do attitude, in which Americans believed they could solve any problem and answer any question. Questions were being asked, and problems would have to be solved. The rebellion found in an awakening is made possible by the economic ease of a high. People have the luxury of taking their focus off of their own immediate survival and noticing what still has to be improved in the world around them. The period of the awakening took place between 1964 and 1980. Initial optimism over the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of the following year gave way to disaffection and riots. According to Dr. Chung-Moon Lee, author of The Hermit King, a biography of the North Korean Kim family, H. Rap Brown and Eldridge Cleaver, along with many other officials of the Black Panthers and other racial separatist movement, actually visited and praised North Korea for its commitment to racial justice. There is something wrong with the society when members of a marginalized group seek out that society's most totalitarian rival as their model. Anyone interested in North Korean racial ideas should read Brian Myers' The Cleanest Race. Other troubles were blooming. The crucible was the Vietnam War, which had begun in 1959, exploded between 1965 and 1969. The number of U.S. troops increased from 16,000 in 1963 to 543,000 by 1968. By the time the United States fully withdrew in 1973, 58,000 Americans had died, 400,000 soldiers had been wounded, 2 presidencies ruined, and the people's faith in the military invincibility of the United States had been completely shattered. Racial tension, economic crisis, and war led to a desire for change in all aspects of life. Second wave feminism covered everything from women's desire for careers outside the home to a non-monogamous lifestyle and alternative spirituality. The decline of urban manufacturing jobs and massive migration into the suburbs led to a larger scale of violence, a different type of crime based around the declining cities. The crimes of this era, according to Lewis Strauss, tended to be very personal. Vigilante-style murders to cover up abuse, robbery, drug dealing. The period of exploration, which an awakening is, can lead to both great achievements and cultural nihilism. It is best understood in the seasonal metaphor of an extended summer. Society ceased to be naive. In the 1970s, for example, television began exploring controversial issues ranging from women's liberation to Watergate. The openness to multiple points of view was a boon. Child-rearing attitudes began to change. Children were valued more and raised more strictly during the high, were, according to conservative thinkers, turned loose during an awakening. Perhaps racial injustice was the greatest blot on the ideals of American democracy beginning in the high period. The old-time tacit support for segregation would no longer do. How would this necessary but terrifying to some whites transition be managed? The integration of sports, football in 1946, baseball a year later, the military in 1948, and the civil service fully in 1949 would be followed by both great achievements and great disaffections. The high would end with President Kennedy's assassination in 1963. It should be understood that violence in this earlier era is different than any other. This is the era of national sanctioned violence and war, as well as what Arnold Toynbee called political frustration violence, largely on the right in opposition to integration. Among some parts of disaffected youth, internecine violence led to taking out frustration in turf gang wars and societal discontent. The corruption and social dislocations of the next 20 years led to many changes. By the 1980s, corporate greed and drug use skyrockets. This is an era of an economic boom which tends to leave many people behind. A right-wing political climate based on the concept of unregulated big business and mindless pursuit of consumerism begins. This is the third cycle, which is known as an unraveling. An unraveling is a societal turning fraught with both the most danger and conversely with the most possibilities. Even more differences in child rearing happened during an unraveling. The need for a 2-income family resulted in large numbers of so-called latchkey children. These young people were both more self-reliant and more fearful. This was the era in which school shootings, which had been happening for quite a long time, begin to explode, and kidnappings and other acts of violence occur more frequently, or at least are publicized more frequently. The need for greater self-awareness had produced a home-based but very self-oriented youth, what Dr. William Strauss called the children on the milk cartons era. Dr. Strauss explains the impact of too much isolation, even when disguised as independence. This is the time of the nomads. These are a group of young people who have been taught they can do anything without any knowledge, with no awareness of the skills required to accomplish any goal. It's not so much the anarchy symbolized by Lord of the Flies as what he called the spastic thrashing of a wounded animal, misguided and somewhat desperate, assuming someone else will make what they want happen. This is a bit of an exaggeration. The positive side of this kind of independence is a strong dedication to self-exploration, environmental issues, and a passion for social justice. Noted children's author Judy Blume explains that being exposed to reality, even unpleasant reality, early, breaks down unrealistic naivete and channels energy and dreams into idealistic development and public service. A group of unsheltered young people can accomplish a lot more. The idea that children and young adults need to be protected from reality is both morally wrong and wasteful, Blume declared. If they have an awareness, life is full of disappointments and difficulty, but that they are capable of overcoming, this will generate a desire to make society more equitable. The negative side of an unraveling is a loss of purpose. Idealism tends to demand an all-or-nothing approach, which is not truly possible. Frustration leads to resentment, discontent, and polarization, which then leads to societal exploitation. As we've seen over the last 10 years or so, computers and social media, wonderful as they are, have also increased tensions, turning societal and personal disagreements into full-fledged chaos and splitting. The unraveling lasted from 1984 until the attacks on 9/11. The temporary unity in the country after the attacks only lasted until the outbreak of the Iraq portion of the war on terror. The economic crisis of 2009 to 2011 created much more frustration, and the election of Donald Trump hardened attitudes on both sides to a level which had not been seen since before the Civil War.
Dr. Howe's theories are certainly very interesting and insightful. And I think they reify many of the things that we're saying and that are supported by statistics. There are some things which I would equivocate with, but okay, that's fine. I like it. I like having different opinions. It's useful. Look, I know we've only scratched the surface of this topic, but it is probably time to bring things to a close now. We don't want to become boring.
No, we don't.
We do have some interesting things coming up, including another podcast on varying exceptionalities, followed by a panel of some really interesting people on a podcast discussing some of these issues. Really kind of exciting. Dr. Deneen is also going to present some really interesting facts and ideas concerning Vietnam. And we are soon launching a new podcast. And this one is way off what we usually have been doing. It's a podcast dealing with alternate histories. It should be kind of fun and entertaining. We got some really cool ideas coming up, and I hope that you would join us in that. We will let you know exactly how to access that as soon as we start getting them up. In the meantime, hey, while you're thinking about it, give us a like, leave a comment, and subscribe if you'd like. We'd love to have your subscription. You'll be informed about new things as they come up if you do that. And most of all, hey, thanks for joining us today. Thanks for tuning in. We really do value you and your comments and what you may have to say. So for now, I'm going to say goodbye.
I agree with Dr. Weaver. This has been a wonderful, challenging, but wonderful experience. I cannot wait to explore this alternative history. That's sort of an intellectual fetish of mine, something I really enjoy talking about. So I'm looking forward to the different ways we can look at it. And please give us a like, give us your comments. When we look at this, we are sustained in what we're trying to do, and we're deeply grateful, friends. All right. So long for now.